Hi everyone, and welcome to PR2700 Project Management. My name is Paul Tilley, and today we're looking at Unit 5, Project Time Management. The content for this module is found in Unit 5, Project Time Management, and in Chapter 6 of the textbook Information Technology Project Management by Schwab. In this module, we will discuss the role of project schedules and good project time management in the on-time delivery of a given project. We'll describe an activity and show how activities can be used as a basis for creating a project schedule. We'll use Gantt charts for planning and tracking schedule information and finding critical paths for a project. And we'll describe how the critical change scheduling and the program evaluation and review technique PERT affect schedule development. So if we look at a project is a one-of. Because of that, there's a certain degree of uncertainty. What we need to be able to do is develop some tools and techniques to be able to assess how long it takes to get a bunch of parts done and what we can expect in terms of those parts for a total time. So for example, if section A takes 10 minutes and section B takes 20 minutes, we would assume that the total time that will be 10 plus 20, 30 minutes. But sometimes individual sections of a project could be completed at the same time. So for example, part A could be made in one part of the building and part B could be made in another part of the building, and two of it could come together to create the finished product. So let's say, for example, part A takes a day to build and part B takes 2 days to build. What we are really looking at is two independent parts, 1 day for one, 2 days for the other. So the total time to produce both of them is really 2 days because it is contingent on the second part, which takes longer. A project needs to develop a schedule before the project work begins because revenue projections are based when the project is in place or when the service can be purchased. Department heads need the staff for new systems. You got to have a staff when the project is ready to roll. And functional managers need to know how long they need their staff as resources for your project. So if you're building a house, how long do you need the carpenters for? The project schedule will be part of a project manager's daily routine while the project is being constructed. Progress is reported against the schedule, and status updates are provided to the stakeholders on a regular basis, and we can check to see if we are on schedule or off schedule or what we can do in order to make up the schedule. So it's a constant iteration of looking at the schedule versus where we are. So if we're thinking about project management, really the crux of this course, we are really thinking about things that need to be done, the processes, in order to be able to create a schedule. Project schedule management, simply defined, involves the processes that are required to ensure timely completion of a given project. And there's really 6 main processes involved in project schedule management. We're going to look at each of them in this course. First of all, planning schedule management. And that involves determining the specific policies, the procedures, and the documentation that will be used for planning, executing, and controlling the project schedule. Second, we're going to define activity. What are the specific activities that the project team members and stakeholders must perform and who's going to perform them to produce the project deliverables? An activity or a task is an element of work normally found on something called a work breakdown structure, and we've looked at that in the last unit. That has these activities have expected durations, expected costs, and expected resource requirements. We have to identify those for each activity. Sequencing activities involves identifying and documenting the relationships between project activities. So we need to think about what comes first, what comes second, what comes third. Requirements and resource breakdown structure and project document updates are all part and parcel of sequencing activities. Fourth, we look at estimating activity durations, and that involves estimating the total number of work periods, days, months, years, that are needed to complete individual tasks within the project. So these activities need to be thought about in terms of how long it's going to take to do them. Fifth, we're going to develop a schedule that involves analyzing activity sequences and resource requirements and activity duration. And this is used really to create the project schedule. Finally, the 6th one involves controlling the schedule, which is so important because it involves ensuring that the project is on schedule and maintaining the schedule so that all of the things that we talked about that are necessary as a project moves forward come at the right time. So the right workers are in the right place at the right time, and the right materials are in the right place at the right time to allow the project to move forward. So project schedule management can be improved by performing the processes we will discuss in this unit and by using some of the basic project management tools and techniques. So in terms of it, the first step in project schedule management is planning how the schedule will be managed throughout the life of the project. So in general, a schedule management plan includes the following information. So first of all, we got project schedule model development, where we actually put the project into a schedule. So many projects include a schedule model, which contains project activities with estimated durations, dependencies, and other planning information that can be used to produce the project schedule. When we look at a program like MS Project, that's what it does. The second thing we need to look at is looking at the level of accuracy in the units of measure. How focused do we want to be? So this section discusses how accurate schedule estimates should be and determines whether time is measured in hours, days, or some other convenient unit. We're also looking at control thresholds, which includes things like the variance. How far do something have to go off schedule for it to start saying, oh, this is a problem? So things like, plus or minus X percent, 10%, I've used it here, are usually put in place. So if something goes off by 10%, if it's gone over by a certain number of days, then it requires a schedule change. Rules of performance measurement. So for example, if team members are expected to track the percentage of work completed, this section specifies how they're going to calculate those percentages. Report formatting. This section really describes the format and the frequency and schedule of the report. So how is the communication being delivered to the stakeholders? What is the schedule of that? Processes descriptions, which is a schedule management plan, also describes how all of the schedule management processes will be performed. So arising out of this, we can identify some key things that we need to do. So project time management involves the processes required to ensure timely completion of a project. And really there's 6 main processes that we need to put in place to ensure the project is well managed. First, we need to define the activities. What is it we're going to do? Then we need to take those activities and sequence them. What gets done first, what gets done second, and so on. Then we need to estimate the activity resources. So what's going to be needed in order to do activity A? Do we need people? Do we need product? Do we need items? Do we need money? What are the things that we need to do that? Then we need to estimate activity durations. How long is it going to take to do that given activity? From there, we develop a schedule. So we add all the activities together. So activity A, B, C, D, and E. And that should be able to give us a timeline. And then we actually start building and we work at controlling the schedule. So is what we said we think would happen actually happening? And what do we do if there's some variances? An activity is a specific event that occurs during the project. And when we think about it, we really need to define some of the concepts around this term activity. First of all, let's look at the actual term activity. So an activity is an element of work that's normally found on the work breakdown structure, and it has an expected duration, cost, and resource requirement. So we need to define activities more detailed within the work breakdown structure, and we have to put in supporting explanations to understand all the work that needs to be done so that we can develop realistic costs and realistic estimates of time. In terms of project schedules, a schedule grows out of the basic document that initiates a project. So the project charter includes start and end dates, budget information, scope statement, and work breakdown structure, and it helps define what needs to be done. So using this information and considering enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets, the project manager and the project team will begin developing a detailed list of activities, their attributes, and the milestone list. The activity list is really a tabulation of all the activities that need to be part of the project. This list should include the activity name, the activity identifier, and a brief description of the activity if it's not absolutely clear. From there, we also look at activity attributes, and that provides some more schedule-related information about each activity. The additional information that comes there include predecessors, what happens before, successors, what happens after, logical relationships between A and B, leads and lag times, in terms of how much lead time is required, how much planning needs to be done. For example, to order cement, if it takes 3 days to get there, you need to consider that a lead time, or lag time, and how long it takes the cement to set. Resource requirements, constraints, imposed dates, and assumptions related to the activity need to be put in that. Finally, we have what's called the milestone. The milestone is really an important marker within the project. So we would think, for example, if we're building a house, that the milestone is actually the day that the people move into the house. It's an important point. So these examples would include sign-off from the customer, key documents, specific products such as software modules being delivered, these sorts of things. These are all considered as milestones. So now that we know what activities are, we got to think about sequencing these activities in order to develop a project. So life would be so much easier if all the activities could be done at the same time by different people, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. You know, it's just you do your thing, I'll do my thing, we'll get it all done, then we'll all bring it together. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Completing project work is not really that simple. Many of the project activities cannot start independent of one another, so activity sequencing is a process of identifying dependency relationships. What needs to be done first, what needs to be done second, between project activities. First, you need to identify the type of dependency and then the specific relationship between the two activities. So talking about dependencies, these are things that inflict problems on projects. So you need to identify 3 categories of dependencies. These include 1, mandatory dependencies, and when you think about it, it makes sense. It's created by the type of work the project requires. For example, a utility crew in a new subdivision can't lay the cables in the ground until the trench is dug by someone else. So someone else needs to do their job before you do yours. That's what's known as a mandatory dependency. Next, we have what's called a discretionary dependency, and sometimes organizations choose to impose on a project certain philosophies of how to do things. So a decision to complete tasks in a specific sequence to conform to an established corporate practice, for example, even if there is an alternative means of sequencing tasks. So for example, if you're a company that says, okay, we need to do extensive testing before we go to the next stage, well, that's creating what's called a discretionary dependency. Third, we have something called an external dependency. And when we think about external dependencies, this is outsiders and we're relying on them for something and we can't do our job until they do theirs. So an external dependency is formally a relationship between a project, task, and some factor outside of the project that drives the scheduling. For example, the activity of installing a new server is really driven by the vendor who needs to deliver the server to have it installed, right? No delivery, can't be installed. So it's important to know the type of dependency that we're really dealing with in every situation. So we have activities and we have dependencies. Now we got to think about how can we use some tool to manage those. And this is where we get into network diagrams. And these are systematic displays of the logical relationships or sequencing of a project. So basically we're putting it down on paper in terms of a flow diagram. There's really 2 major formats for network diagrams. There's the arrow diagramming method and the procedural diagramming method. First, let's look at the arrow diagramming method. The arrow diagramming method has something called nodes and arrows. Okay? Nodes are circles, and they are the starting and ending points of an activity. The activity itself is symboled in the arrow or above the arrow. So, for example, activity A takes place between node 1 and 2. And you'll also notice that there's a time associated with it. So activity A takes 1 day. Activity B takes place between node 1 and 3, and it takes 2 days. And activity C takes 3 days, and it occurs between 1 and 4. The full grouping of activities takes place along the timeline to the right. As time moves along, it moves to the right. So you can see that there are several activities that carry on through this whole project, and we can see how long the given times take and the node points. So the second major type of network diagram is something called the precedence diagramming method, and this by far is the most common type of system. So what we do in that is we figure out events, and we say, okay, here's an activity, here's another activity. What is the dependency relationship between two of those? Is one dependent with the other? We've got four basic types of dependency situations that we assess within the network diagramming for precedence. The first network diagram is the one that really is most common. That's the finish to start. And effectively, the finish to start says, look, you can't start the next item, we'll call it activity B, until you finish the first item. We'll call it activity A. So activity A has to be completed before moving to activity B. The second type of precedence deals with the start-to-start relationship. And what a start-to-start relationship really says is, look, you can start the first task, A, and you can start the second task, B, all at the same time, provided that A has started. Okay, you can't do B without A actually starting. So, for example, a user guide documentation can start when the requirements definition starts. We got it all figured out, basically. If you don't have a clear understanding of what the requirements are, however, you can't start the user guide. Next, and similarly to start, is finish to finish. And what we're focused here on is when does it end. So the finish to finish relationship has the finish of the successor task, task B, dependent on the finish. So, for example, a new product is finished when the customer manual is complete. If the customer manual is delayed, the product can't be released. The last type of situation where you'd run into in a network precedence diagram is a start to finish example. Basically what's happening here is the finish of the successor task, B, is dependent on the start of the predecessor task, meaning A has to actually start in order for B to get finished. So if you have a news conference, for example, the news conference has to start before the person who's covering the news conference can finish their day. Part and parcel with activities is the resources that those activities will require, and we need to think about how do we consider the resources required in each activity. So the goal of activity resource estimating is to estimate resources needed for each activity so we can deploy it in an effective manner. So in some instances, assigning more resources speeds up the process. In others, well, it really doesn't change the speed of the process, or in fact could slow it down owing to communication needs and these sorts of things that would come of so many things happening at once. So the nature of the project and the organization itself is certainly going to affect the amount of resources. We use things like expert judgment, analysis of alternatives, estimating data, and project management software such as MS Project in order to help figure out what we need in terms of resources for each activity. So one output of the resource estimating process is the resource breakdown structure, and you'll find this in project management software. And effectively, if you look at it, it's just a simple diagram that kind of looks at resources and breaks them down into fundamental components. So for example, if we look at resources, four of the key resources that you would think that any activity would have would be labor, material, tools, and potentially fees. We can take labor and break it down even further, such as specific types of personnel or project management people or users. So different skill sets effectively. We can take material and break it down into expendables, stuff that's used up, assemblies, stuff that's used in the construction, components, parts and pieces, and ingredients such as things like cement. And we can think of tools. What are the tools that were required for that activity? Heavy machinery, power tools, hand tools, these sorts of things. So these are all important components that flow out of the activities that a lot of software will help plan out, because those are important things to get the job done. So we focused on activities and the resources required by those activities. Now we're taking a look at time. and time durations, we'll call it, is important to estimate because it's going to determine when the project is complete. Okay, so after working with key stakeholders to define activities, determine their dependencies, and estimate the resources, the next process in project time management is to estimate the duration of given activities. This phase generally involves using both project scope and resource information to estimate the duration of the project activities. The people with the greatest knowledge of the specific activity are the most often called on to approve the estimation. It's important to note that duration includes the actual amount of time worked on the activity plus elapsed time, whereas effort is the number of work days or work hours required to complete the given task. Duration relates to the time estimate, not the effort estimate. Duration estimates are often provided as a discrete number, such as 4 weeks, or as a range, such as 3 to 5 weeks, or as a 3-point estimate. A 3-point estimate is an estimate that includes an optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic estimate. An example would be an optimistic estimate of 3 weeks, a most likely estimate of 4 weeks, and a pessimistic estimate of 5 weeks. So schedule development is an iterative process designed to determine start and finish dates for project activities. Schedule development is where we put together all of the other work from schedule planning. An accurate schedule needs all of the activities, the sequence of these activities, and the length of each activity to be brought together. The ultimate goal of developing a schedule is to create a realistic project schedule that provides a basis for monitoring project progress from the time dimension of the project. Some of the tools and techniques available to assist schedule development include Gantt charts, critical path analysis, critical change scheduling, and PERT analysis. The first tool is the Gantt chart. Now, the Gantt chart is very common. It's really a bar chart that provides a visible way of illustrating the sequence of activities in a project. So Gantt charts provide a standard format for displaying project schedule information by listing project activities down the side. So you see here, for example, task name would include planning, research, design, implementation, and follow-up. So those would be the activities. And we take those activities and across the top, we have the corresponding start and finish dates in the calendar format. So for example, we start here in January through to March. We have planning going on. Research happens effectively at the same time. We can see research starting in February and going through to March. Design really can't start right away, but there are certain aspects of it that can probably start, say, for example, in March. It will carry right through until mid-April. The implementation of the design really is dependent on the design being largely finished. So we see that it moves a little bit to the right of that. So that goes from April through to July. And then the follow-up can start after most of that is done, and that would run through July as well. That's what a Gantt chart does. Another tool in the toolbox of project scheduling is the critical path method. And it's often called a critical path analysis. And really it's a network analysis technique that determines the sequence of task activities that directly affect the completion of the project. Shortest possible time in which a project can be completed. So a project's critical path is the longest path through the network diagram that illustrates the shortest amount of time in which a project can be completed. The activities appearing on the critical path of a network diagram are termed critical tasks. If any of the activities are delayed along the critical path, the completion of the entire project will be delayed. Activities not on the critical path can be delayed to some extent, without really affecting the duration of the entire project. Accordingly, these activities are called slack time. Often it's called float too, as the amount of time an activity may be delayed without delaying the success of the project. So let's look at an example of this critical path method. What we have here is a network diagram that we've seen a little earlier on, and really, just recall, we have the nodes, which are the rounds, and these would be the start and end points, and the activities would be represented by the lines. So each line has a number associated with it. That number represents the time, how long it takes, 1 hour, 2 hours, days, whatever. What we do is we calculate the critical path by adding the durations of all the activities on each path through the network diagram. So you've basically got to look at every potential path through the diagram and add up the times to get your total time for each potential path. So let's take a look at the potential paths here. Well, path 1, we have ADHJ, and that would be A would be 1, D would be 4, H would be 6, J would be 3. That'd be a total of 14 days. Let's look at path 2, BEHJ. So BEHJ is indeed the critical path, so what we need to be able to do is look at it. So here I've illustrated it. B is 2, E is 5, H is 6, and J is 3 for a total of 16 days. All of the others, path 3 and 4, BFJ and CGIJ, all represent shorter periods of time. So, when we think about this, we got to think, what is the maximum time? So the critical path is reflected on the maximum time, the longest duration. So the path 2, as illustrated here, would be considered the critical path. We can't, if either of those projects got delayed, or any of those activities, between the activities got delayed, it would affect the total time frame of the project. Paths outside of the critical path, if they got delayed, they may not necessarily affect the length of time of the project because there's already slack in those. In other words, those take less time to do than the total longest time anyway. So critical path analysis really looks at what is the longest possible time required, and everything else has a certain degree of float or slack time in it that could be adjusted. We have to ask ourselves then, what happens if you calculate this and you realize, oops, it's going to take longer than what we had scheduled for the project. So there's a number of duration compression scheduling techniques that can come into play here that can speed the project up. These techniques can be used up front to shorten the planning duration of the project, or during the project execution to resolve some schedule slippage. So 2 major things to talk about with regards to duration compression. First, there's something called crashing, which is throwing extra resources at a particular activity in an attempt to get it finished sooner. Okay, so crashing is a technique that there's going to be a trade-off because it's going to cost more, right? You need to think about how much extra money you're going to have to put into this in order to get it to speed up. So we have to think how much extra and worry about cost as we say that's a good option. The next thing we look at is something called fast tracking, which is a performance of activities in parallel that would normally be performed in sequence. So can we do things at the same time effectively is what we're asking. Yet another tool in the toolkit is something called PERT, which is Program Evaluation and Review Technique. Now, it's a network analysis technique that's used to estimate project duration. This is particularly useful whenever we're not really sure. We have this situation of, this is brand new, we don't have a really good handle on what the estimate is going to be. So what we do with PERT is we come up with 3 options. We come up with an optimistic, most likely, and a pessimistic scenario. And we use that then to be able to generate some estimates. We take a weighted average of the probability of a given optimistic, most likely pessimistic event happening, and we use that then to create a weighted average as illustrated in the diagram above. All we've talked about here is really controlling the schedule. The whole focus has been, how can we get the schedule on time? Well, we've looked at some mathematical tools, but there are a lot of tools in the toolkit, including progress reports, schedule change control systems to make sure that people have to jump through hoops before schedules get changed, a scheduling tool such as a project management software such as MS Project, comparison bar charts to be able to compare it with other projects, or Gantt charts as we've seen here, variance analysis, how far are we off our estimates, what if scenarios, adjusting lead times, adjusting lag times, scheduling compression, measuring the performance, and resource leveling. As I say, an important tool to be able to do all this stuff is MS Project, and we will be looking at in this course MS Project, or you'll be using it as a tool. I want you to look at these couple of videos that I've linked here and ensure that you have a good idea how to apply the techniques that are talked about in what we've talked about here today in MS Project. Anyway, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.